the war on terror is not over. And perhaps someone ought to remind the president of that. His silence on this, or not so much silence, but the kind of pablum he's issued since it happened, his non-appearance in Paris, his non-leadership on this is rather staggering. But it is not out of character. I think it was in May or June 2013, he gave a speech at the National Defense University, which I urge you to go back and read. It was not a casual address. It was not off the cuff. It was a major statement of policy in which he essentially said, the war on terror is destructive to our character, to our democracy, and to our values. It needs to end. And he can't quite decide whether it simply needs to end or perhaps it's already ended. If you listen to him in the 2012 campaign, it had ended. Osama bin Laden was dead. Al-Qaeda was on the run. And we were now cleaning up here and there a JV team. Well, the JV team are now a championship team. They now control parts of Syria, 1/3 of Iraq, large elements of Yemen, the northern territories of Pakistan. They're resurging now, of course, in Afghanistan. Libya is a playground for jihadists. If it weren't for the French, they would have control of Mali. The northern part of Nigeria is now its own caliphate, run by the Boko Haram, who openly pride themselves in enslaving and selling women into slavery. So that's who we're dealing with. They are on the rise, and we have a president who either, and this I can't quite figure out, either deliberately or by self-delusion, thinks that this somehow is ending. And you see him acting on that, releasing prisoners from Guantanamo. You release prisoners of war when the war is over. That's how it's been done since the caveman. You don't do it in the middle of a war. So you can see the actions he's undertaking, and you can see the fact that he really is very reluctant to engage the U.S. He thinks it's a wrong turn. He will not even use the term Islamic in talking about this kind of radicalism or terrorism, whereas the socialist prime minister of France used the word. He said, we're at war with radical Islamism. So did the prime minister of Britain, but Obama can't bring himself to. The takeaway is the war continues. And the second, the corollary of that is that you cannot unilaterally declare a war over. It takes two to tango. As long as the other side is engaged in the war, and we saw it in Charlie Hebdo, we saw it in the kosher market, we saw it in the killing of, 1,200 students in Pakistan. We saw it last week in northern Nigeria. Amnesty International says that something like 2,000 innocent people were simply slaughtered by Boko Haram. So this is an ongoing, raging, ugly, and very violent war. We can abdicate if we want, but we can't pretend it's over. Well, I'm a habitual chooser of the minority side. I think it's a character flaw of mine, but I tend to gravitate that way. On this issue, I have no objection in principle to normalizing relations with Cuba. But I do think after 50 years of heroic sacrifice by human rights activists in Cuba, imprisonment, exile, death for many, torture, ostracism, that we owe them at a minimum to get some kind of relaxation of the police state in return. We don't need Cuba. Our trade with the rest of the world is near infinite. Cuba will make no difference whatsoever. Cuba needs us. So when you're in a situation of that kind of asymmetry, and you have a kind of moral obligation to extremely heroic people who, in concert with the United States, have tried to mollify, to in some ways, to mitigate the worst parts of the police state apparatus in Cuba, you owe them to get something in return. Fidel Castro and his brother had to wait through 10 presidencies, 4 of them Democrats, some of them quite liberal, in order to get to a president who would give the Castro brothers everything they want in return for nothing. That's the scandal. If we made a deal in which, say, we lifted part of the embargo in return for internet access for ordinary Cubans as the beginning, and then relaxation of other things, and we would relax more parts of the embargo, I'd be all in favor. I advocated for a $1 gas tax in my column this week. I first wrote about this in 1983, so it's not something that's come to me lately. I have written about this at least 10 times. I've had 0 effect on the world, and I had really given up 6 years ago when I wrote the last time on this. But there's an opportunity every time gas prices collapse. That's the time where if you're ever going to have a tax, that's when you impose it. You don't impose it when gas is $4. And I've gotten just a lot of abuse, which I knew was coming, so I'm not surprised. I'm somewhat amused. The whole point of the thing I proposed is that the government gets no money out of this, and the average consumer is left entirely whole, because it's not just a $1 gas tax. It's a gas tax where at the same time everybody gets a $14 a week corresponding cut in the Social Security tax, so essentially your take-home pay. Why does it it's $12 a week. Why 12? Because that's the average American uses 12 gallons of gasoline a week. So the tax will take $12 out of his or her pocket. You give it back a week before. So essentially it's revenue neutral. The point is to shift the incentive. It's a conservative idea to have consumption rather than income taxes. That's sort of one of the fundamental ideas of conservatism. And in the absence of general tax reform, where you eliminate loopholes and you lower rates, which is the ideal of tax reform, in the absence of that, I would simply do a $1 gas tax. Everybody gets the money back essentially in a FICA rebate, and then you alter the balance of incentives. One of the great things about it is that if you do that, you can eliminate all the regulations about the mileage standards that the EPA and the Energy Department impose on automobiles, which is insane, rigid, irrational. You could wipe them all out, because if the price of gasoline is high, people will buy fuel-efficient cars. But it was just a way of throwing a grenade into a parade, that's all. And it has succeeded.